The sun rose quietly over the lake, its reflection a shimmering path leading from my dock to the horizon. A soft mist clung to the water's surface, whispering secrets known only to morning birds, sang their melodies a gentle prelude to the day. It was here amidst this serenity that I found peace. My boat, a modest vessel with its paint peeling in places, bobbed gently at the water's edge, tethered to the dock like a contented dog. This was my sanctuary. But peace, it seemed, was a fragile thing. The neighborhood held a different kind of truth, one wrapped in the rigid arms of the homeowners association presided over by Karen. She was a woman of rules and order, viewing the world through the narrow lens of covenants and codes. Karen thrived in the HOA. It suited her like a crown fits a queen, and she wielded her power as if defending a fiefdom. Karen's first act was a letter. A crisp, perfumed missive slipped into my mailbox. The paper was thick, embossed with the HOA's emblem, a tree, ironically given how rigid and unyielding it seemed in their hands. The words were clipped precise. My boat, she informed me, was in violation of community guidelines. Docking was only permitted for vessels of a certain length with aesthetic considerations that my humble craft evidently failed. I read the letter twice. Once in disbelief, the second time with a growing sense of amusement. I could almost hear her voice in the curt sentences, see her pursed lips as she penned it. This was Karen in all her glory, a force of nature, perhaps not quite as benevolent as the lake's gentle waves. Fines were threatened. I was to comply or face penalties. The ultimatum was clear carved in bureaucratic stone. Yet standing there in the morning light, I felt an odd sense of calm. Like the lake, I refused to ripple at her bidding. Instead, I went about my day. The routine tasks that filled my life, tending to the garden, reading on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, were my own acts of rebellion. I let the letter sit on the kitchen counter, a silent testament to the absurdity of it all. It was a game, after all, one that Karen was keen to play, but I had yet to decide my move. The community was a tapestry, each thread connected. But distinct Karen's was a bright, insistent line running through it, dictating the pattern. Mine was quieter, blending into the background content to exist in harmony. But even the quietest threads could shift the design, given the right pull. As I walked to the end of my dock, the wood warm beneath my feet, I considered Karen's letter. It was not just a demand. It was an opportunity, a chance to weave a new motif into the community's fabric. I took a deep breath, the air rich with the scent of pine and promise, and smiled. The day was young, and the lake was patient. Patience, I thought, was a kind of strength, one I intended to wield with subtlety and care. In the distance, Karen's house stood like a fortress, curtains drawn, her world carefully curated. I wondered if she ever saw the lake as I did, as something more than a backdrop. I doubted it. For now, I would let her believe she held the upper hand. For now, I would wait. Plans form, slowly like the tide rising, and I had all the time in the world. The morning after the notice appeared on my door, a curious mixture of defiance and calm settled within me. Karen, with her penchant for precision and petty power, had escalated our little conflict by citing me for docking my boat in the reserved slip. A rule she conveniently conjured, a rule that somehow didn't exist until my boat bobbed in the water like an uninvited guest. The air was thick with an impending storm, a perfect metaphor for the tumultuous events unfolding. Clouds gray and bloated loomed as I steered my thoughts towards a plan. Karen, with her ironclad clipboard and officious demeanor, believed she held the upper hand. But she had overlooked the silent ripples of influence I could create, ripples that would soon swell into waves, disrupting her precious order. The HOA meetings, typically dreary affairs, had become Karen's stage. She'd parade rules and regulations, delighting in details, her voice clipping through the air like scissors. I attended, silent, an observer in shadows, noting her patterns, her allies, Karen's power wasn't absolute, merely assumed wrapped in thin veils of procedure. Her latest edicts were absurd. Grass could be no longer than 2 inches. Bird feeders were temporary eyesores. Even children's laughter seemed an offense during her self-imposed quiet hours. She sowed seeds of division, cultivating a garden of grievances, each one nurtured with whispers and frowns. I listened unmoved until she reached for the lifeblood of our community. The lake fishing, a pastime dear to many, was now under threat. Karen spoke of conservation, but the gleam in her eyes betrayed her true intent: control. Her plan, though wrapped in environmental concern, was transparent, a bid to extend her reach into waters she barely understood. The irony was rich. She didn't even like fish, but the act of banning others from it was the real feast. Power on a silver platter. Amidst her proclamations, I remained composed, my own plan unfurling silently. The fees, a forgotten detail to most, were my gateway. The bylaws, practically a novel of bureaucratic twists, had room for adjustments. A careful reading revealed the power to propose changes. A loophole she'd neglected. In her certainty, I drafted my proposal meticulously, a subtle readjustment of club fees more in line with our community's needs, or my version of them. The increased fees would fund repairs, improvements, restorations to places. Karen seldom ventured, but held sway over, nonetheless. It would also deliciously highlight her own mismanagement and hubris. The day of the meeting arrived, and with it a quiet confidence. My proposal was presented with a smile, the kind that suggests sincerity, but cloaks intent. The room held its breath, the tension palpable. Karen's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. It was a small victory, but the satisfaction was immense. A murmur spread like wildfire through the attendees. Some nodded, others whispered, but the motion carried with surprising ease. The result, a shift in the balance, a subtle reclamation of power. Karen's face was a portrait of disbelief. Her authority chipped away, if only slightly. As the meeting adjourned, I felt the weight of her glare. She, who had wielded control so effortlessly, was now caught in the web of her own making. A part of me braced for her retaliation, knowing her nature. Yet, as I walked away, I couldn't help but relish the irony. Sometimes the best way to navigate a storm is not to resist the waves, but to sail skillfully through them, letting the winds of change propel you forward. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting shadows that crisscrossed the floor like the bars of a cage. My coffee steamed quietly, its tendrils twisting upwards, whispering promises of clarity. I sat at the kitchen table, the aftermath of the last HOA meeting still echoing in my mind. Karen's smug, self-congratulatory smile burned brightly at the forefront of my thoughts, a vivid image that refused to fade. Her latest decree, fines for docking my boat. My pride and joy hung in the air like a fog. It was a calculated move, one designed not for community benefit, but for exertion of power. Her power, a petty tyrant in a pastel cardigan. But I had learned to navigate these waters as adeptly as any sailor I knew. The ropes, the loopholes, and most importantly, the levers of power within our quaint, manicured neighborhood. I spent the week documenting every act of overreach, every arbitrary decision. The rules were clear, and Karen's transgressions left a trail like breadcrumbs through a forest. I gathered evidence like a squirrel hoarding acorns, each piece more damning than the last. Late at night, the dim glow of my computer screen illuminated my plans, casting a stark contrast between the mundane reality and the simmering rebellion beneath. The HOA bylaws were an intricate tapestry, woven with threads of legality and loopholes, and I had spent years understanding every nuance. It was time to pull on those threads. At the heart of the community's regulations lay the club fees, a malleable entity, subject to change by majority vote. And who held the majority? A curious coalition of neighbors who, like me, had grown weary of Karen's reign. We convened quietly, a gathering of discontent faces lit by the gentle glow of patio lanterns. We spoke in hushed tones, conspiratorial yet determined. The plan was simple: raise the fees, redistribute the balance of power. Karen's precious fishing privileges would be the first casualty. With her access revoked, she would be like a queen without her court, her dominion reduced to mere shadows. The day of the vote dawned bright and clear, an incongruously beautiful backdrop to the quiet rebellion I watched as Karen took her usual seat, oblivious to the shifting tides beneath her feet. The agenda unfolded point by point, until at last, the vote. A formality on the surface, yet beneath a seismic shift. The tension in the room was palpable, the air electric with unspoken truths. And then the moment arrived, as swift and inevitable as the turning of the tide. Karen's eyes widened, a flash of disbelief, quickly masked by indignant outrage. But it was too late. The majority held, and the new fees were set, sealing her fate with the quiet finality of a judge's gavel. In the silence that followed, I felt a serene satisfaction, the kind that comes not from vengeance but from justice served. Karen's empire had crumbled, a castle built on sand. And as I left the sun dipping below the horizon, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony. She had tried to cage me. But in the end, it was her own chains she forged. A small victory perhaps, but one that tasted sweet. A wind was picking up around the lake, rippling the water into tiny waves that lapped persistently against the dock. The same dock where months ago Karen had stood with her clipboard, her voice shrill, eyes narrowing over the rims of her oversized sunglasses. That day, she had declared my small, weather-beaten boat a violation of the HOA's sacred decree. Her accusations had poured out in a torrent, her words precise and unforgiving, much like the fines she'd threatened. Now the change was palpable. The pristine lawns and manicured hedges of the neighborhood were less vibrant under the pall of tension. My own heart felt light, buoyed by the knowledge that I had turned the tides. The club fees were raised, a decision I'd orchestrated with a few carefully chosen words at the last board meeting, cloaked in logic and fiscal necessity. The irony was delicious. The fees justified under the guise of community improvement projects. Projects that would take months, years, even to materialize if they ever did. I took a slow walk through the neighborhood, my presence now a curious spectacle. Neighbors pretended not to notice, but their glances lingered. A few offered tight-lipped smiles, wary perhaps of aligning themselves too closely with either side of this unspoken war. Others avoided eye contact altogether, as though my newfound influence might be contagious. The air hummed with unspoken grievances. A group of children played nearby, their laughter ringing over the tension like church bells in a storm. It was a sound of innocence, one that seemed incongruous in the charged atmosphere. Groaning under the weight of new restrictions, the HOA board had reluctantly endorsed a temporary ban on fishing. Yet another move in my quiet campaign. Karen's outraged reaction to this had been as satisfying as the first bite of a crisp apple in autumn. As I strolled past Karen's house, her blinds twitched. I imagined her on the other side, eyes narrowed, calculating her next move. She was not one to concede easily. Power was her language, and she would not go down without a fight. The thought amused me, the image of her pacing like a caged lioness, her domain reduced to a shadow of its former self. In the days that followed, The community simmered. Rumors spread like wildflowers in spring, each new whisper adding fuel to the fire. Meetings were tense, laughter rare. The lake, once a symbol of serenity, now mirrored the fractious mood of the residents. Fishermen grumbled their routine, disrupted by the ban. Yet no one dared to challenge the new status quo openly. The balance had shifted, and it was intoxicating. To hold power, to wield it so subtly that it was almost invisible. But beneath the surface, like the lake's gentle ripples, change was constant and inevitable. I knew that Karen would not remain complacent. Her silence was the calm before a storm. One. I was prepared to weather. The board was my shield, the bylaws my sword. As night fell, the lake shimmered under the silver light of the moon. Silence descended thick and expectant. I stood by the dock once more, the spot where it had all begun. The air was cooler now, filled with the scent of possibility. Karen's world had been so sure, so ordered until it wasn't. In the quiet, I could almost hear her plotting the gears turning in her mind. But for now, I relished the peace, the soft promise of a new day. The game was far from over, and I was ready. The lake, my silent ally, watched over us all. The sunrise draped its golden hue over the marina, casting elongated shadows that danced across my lawn. I stood at the edge of my dock, the air crisp with the scent of dew and distant pines. The boat bobbed gently, a silent witness to the storm of bureaucracy that had unfolded. It seemed almost serene in its indifference to the human conflicts playing out on shore. Karen's letter had arrived with all the pomp of a royal decree, each line dripping with officious intent. It was a wonder, really, how she managed to cram so much self-importance into a single page. A fine for docking my boat. A mere technicality, yet she wielded it like a saber. Her latest attempt to tighten the reins of her miniature fiefdom. I knew what this was, an assertion of control, a reminder of the hierarchy she fancied herself atop. Yet beneath the calm ripple of the lake, beneath the placid surface of my demeanor, lay a current of something more potent. I had always believed in quiet power, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. So while Karen rallied her troops and forged her petty fines, I took a different path, a quieter path. A legal path. The board meeting was set for the following week. I'd prepared meticulously, poring over HOA bylaws and financial reports, delving into the intricacies of our community's operations. My proposal was simple yet impactful. A reevaluation of club fees, an analysis of resource allocation. On paper, it was a fiscal necessity. In reality, it was a masterstroke. The day of the meeting arrived a tableau of anxious faces and rustling papers. Karen, of course, presided with a smugness that only bolstered my resolve. I made my case with precision, weaving through statistics with the ease of a seasoned sailor navigating familiar waters. The board listened, nodding along caught in the tide of logic and reason. When the vote came, it passed. Club fees would rise, a necessary adjustment in light of my findings. But the real coup de grace, the prohibition of fishing from the communal docks, was buried within the fine print. A footnote easily overlooked by those not accustomed to reading between the lines. Karen's expression shifted subtly as she realized the implications, a flash of surprise crossing her features like a cloud blocking the sun. Later, as I strolled back to my now legalized dock, I pondered the irony. There was no need for confrontation or drama. Just the steady application of rules, the kind that Karen herself revered. In a world of noise sometimes, the quietest voice held the most weight. I had turned the tables. Not with aggression, but with the very tools Karen cherished. The lake remained undisturbed, a mirror of calm reflecting the sky's azure expanse. In its stillness, I found a certain poetry, a lesson perhaps in patience and precision. The boat rocked gently, the water lapping at its sides with rhythmic constancy. My victory, like the lake, was vast and composed. And as I watched the sun slip below the horizon, I understood. In the grand theater of human folly, sometimes the most effective revenge is to simply let the story unfold with quiet inevitability. The early morning fog clung to the lake like a ghost that refused to leave. My breath hovered in the chilly air as I stood on the dock. The calm water reflecting the graying sky, I watched as the community, once divided by petty politics and power plays, began to find its rhythm again. The lake, serene and silent, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the story to finish unfolding. Karen had been a storm, a relentless whirling dervish of rules and fines. She had made herself the self-appointed guardian of the homeowners association, wielding the rule book like a sword, but she underestimated the quiet strength of those she sought to control. The community had grown weary of her reign. Her obsession with order had created chaos. Fines for docking boats, threats for late club fees, harassing letters about mailbox colors. Each action chipped away at the facade of harmony she tried to construct, revealing the cracks beneath. I had played my part orchestrating a change through subtlety and patience. The board meeting was a turning point the moment the balance shifted. I watched them squirm in their high-backed chairs as I presented the new budget. Higher club fees, strategically targeted expenses. Karen's eyes narrowed, calculating. She hadn't expected this. In the end, she was outmaneuvered not by force but by the very rules she cherished. The vote was swift. The decision unanimous. Karen found herself sidelined, stripped of her power like a queen, dethroned by her own court. The irony was almost poetic. The community turned the page and life began to settle. The lake, with its mirror-like surface, provided solace. The dock was a place for renewal, a place where the lines between nature and humanity blurred. It was here that I found a strange tranquility, the kind that comes from knowing a storm has passed. The fishing ban had been my final act, a symbolic gesture. Yes, but one that resonated deeply. The joy of casting a line, of reeling in a catch, was a simple pleasure that should belong to everyone. Karen's favorite pastime now out of her grasp. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that power is ephemeral. I looked around at the community now gathering for the annual lake cleanup. Neighbors greeted each other with nods and smiles, the tension of past months slowly evaporating. Children chased each other along the shore, their laughter mingling with the cries of distant gulls. It was a symphony of normalcy, a return to what mattered. Karen stood apart, watching with a mixture of resentment and resignation. Her battle was over, but the scars remained. Yet there was something in her gaze, a flicker of understanding. Perhaps she too was a part of this fragile ecosystem bound by the same unspoken rules of harmony and coexistence. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The quiet was my ally, my accomplice in the gentle revolution that had unfolded. Here on the dock I found peace. Life had a way of finding equilibrium, of rediscovering its own rhythm after chaos. And as the fog lifted, revealing the clear blue of the lake, I knew the community had done the same.